All right, folks, welcome to a week 7, day 4 of Hotel Evening and Weekend Platoon. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about APIs and getting data from external sources. So, everything that we've talked about so far in the web programming unit and also more broadly in the unit on Python and JavaScript has all been based on, to some extent, hard coding your data, right? So, for example, if you are designing, when we first learned about functions, and you were designing your own functions, you ran those based on data that the user had to input. Or for some of the assessments, you guys learned how to take in information, say, from a Excel spreadsheet and import that into Python or JavaScript, etc. But Excel spreadsheets don't really change. Same way, user input is something that's a little bit difficult to get at times, and hard coding your data is just in general not a good idea. So today's lesson is going to essentially answer the question of how can I get data that changes or get data from a source on the web? And that's where something called an API comes in. Can anyone tell me what API stands for?
Application programming interface.
Okay. I'll ask a follow-up. Those are three words. What does that mean for you or anyone else who wants to tackle it? What does an API mean to you?
You know, Omar, it might sound kind of strange, but I almost saw it as like a little, like a gatekeeper that kind of gave permissions to some people to get certain parts of data, but limited others, uh, other users to get certain data. So it's not only just allowing access, but also acting like a little, um, like a policeman saying, okay, you have permissions to access this part of the data, but this guy doesn't.
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is an API, you can say it's like a gatekeeper. I would prefer to call it like a bridge between two different, or part of a bridge between two systems, right? So if you have, let's say, your computer wants to get data from some other source, then the API is part of the network of things that you use to make that happen. Because without an API, you can't really connect those two sources together to some extent. Um, so we're going to be using the tool that I'm sharing right now is called Postman, which is a simple way to use and to access and test APIs. You won't really use Postman in production environments, excuse me, but you will end up using it, hopefully a good amount, when you're just playing around and trying to get a feeling for what a specific API can do, what types of data you can unlock, and how to unlock it. So there is a web version of Postman, but I would highly recommend on downloading the application itself, which is what I've done here. It downloads relatively quickly, probably in about 2 or 3 minutes on a decent internet connection. So we'll go back to Postman in a couple minutes, but for now, let's go ahead and play with an example of an API. Okay, can everyone see my browser? Awesome. So there's a lot of APIs floating around out there. Uh, this one is a relatively simple, it's a fake and reliable API for testing and prototyping. What does this API do or get us? Well, we can open up the guide and see what sort of links it has. So looks like this looks like a link that you can do something with, and we don't know how to read this code yet. So we're going to forget that. Let's type this in our browser and see what happens. And I'm going to trim pretty print on for future. So let's break this down. What type of data structure is this?
JSON.
Okay, JSON, but what is JSON?
It's a dictionary.
It's a dictionary. Perfect. So whenever we get any data, this is not just for this API, but basically with a couple caveats, any API. When you call an API and get data back, you're going to get it back in a JSON format, which in turn is a dictionary. So when you are interpreting your data via in Python or in JavaScript, you're always going to want to keep in mind that JSON equals dictionary. Um, so naturally, when you import this data into Python or whatnot, you can access it something via its keys, right, of like title or body or ID, blah blah blah, and then you can get the thing on the other side. Another thing to mention is that in JSON, you can have nested dictionaries or nested JSON, quote unquote. So let's say inside body, instead of body just being a string, body could be another dictionary inside there. So you'll want to keep that in mind. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be fetching from this URL, this JSON placeholder typecode.com slash posts slash one. We're going to go back to Postman. And ideally, when we type that in our GET request, which is what we're going to be doing, or which is what we're going to be doing, we should get a response back that roughly matches up with what we just saw on this website. So let's hit send. It's now it sent out my GET request. And if we look down in the body, we see here that we get back JSON. We get back the exact identical JSON. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The first one is that we get a 200 OK code on the right. So that means that the request was successful and the servers responded as required. It tells you how long it took and how large in terms of size the response was. And then this gives you a bunch more detail about the network connection. Importantly, you don't have to visualize your response back as JSON. You can receive it, read it in its raw form as text. You can receive it as HTML on occasion if it's formatted as that, or you can receive it as JSON. Sometimes you might want to receive it as HTML in case you're returning a full-on website. However, we're not doing, well, let's see an example of that. So let's see what happens if we return Google.com and see what happens. So yeah, Google.com, it is a valid web address, right? So we're still getting a 200 OK code. But if we return this as JSON, this looks pretty messy. And this also is a doc type HTML. So that's a case where returning it as HTML can be useful instead of returning it as JSON, because now you're just reading it as HTML. You can also preview the GET request if it's again returning HTML, and it'll show you the web page. So that's another useful example. Let's just see what happens if we'll go back to that previous example. If we go to a bad URL, so here we get a 200 OK saying the request was successful. Let's just mistype this, and let's delete some more. So this is probably going to be a bad link. And let's see if we still get a successful JSON back or not. All right, so it looks like this failed. So let's see if we can view in a console and see what happened. So we have this GET request here, and we have an error. It says get address info not found. What does that mean? Well, the original source does not exist. And as you see, this was not returned with a 200 code. This was returned with an error. So does the overall principle of Postman make sense? Any questions about this?
I can wrap my head around it.
Okay, awesome. Anyone else have any questions?
The Postman is simply to test that before you actually start to try to fetch it or try to pull it down into your actual HTML. So it's just a test of it before you use it. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. So I'll give you an example for where Postman can be really useful. API documentation is very unreliable. Sometimes you'll have a website or an API that has great documentation. About 50 to 70% of the time, in my experience, you'll come across an API that you're like, this in theory solves all my problems. It's got exactly the type of data I want, the type of data I need, and there's no documentation. So if you're trying to figure out how an API works, like for example, instead of making a GET request, you can also make a POST request, which is something that sends data to your API and returns something. So if you're trying to send data to an API, but you don't know what form fields it accepts, for example, then you can mess around with it in Postman to examine what types of fields it asks for and what types of fields it gives you in its JSON response. Um, and then after that, you can send things over to Python or JavaScript and use it then. So this is basically like an API playground, is the way I would think about it. Any other questions? I'm just going to make sure that this link still works. Okay, and that it does. So we're now going to do, just again, as an example, a post request. So a post request will send data over to the API source and return something from that. This is different from a GET request, where a GET request only receives information. So the distinction here is that with a post request, we need to send some data over. We need to send data over to our source. So let's see. Uh, what am I? Oh, there we go. Click raw. So yeah, as you'll notice, whoops, with a post request, you have to give it data to send over, and you can do that by providing a body in your API call or API request. So again, what type of requests are we making? Well, what is the data type of an API request? Oh, come on, guys, we just went over this.
JSON.
A
JSON.
dictionary. Yeah.
Yes. Well, yeah, both of those are correct.
Mhm.
So when you're sending data to an API, the data you send over also has to be in JSON format, which again is going to look something like this. So in this specific case, I know from experience the type of data that I'm trying to post. However, we can verify that by going to the API's documentation, or in this case, the guide for how to use this API. So let's take a look. This over here is going to be our post request. This uses the JavaScript format, which we're not going to talk about right now, but you can see here it says method post. And then this is the stuff that goes in the body. What's the stuff that goes in the body? Is that. Because that's the part that looks like JSON. So we'll go back to Postman, which is right here. And we'll put this in the proper format, and we'll use our double quotes instead of singles.
Hmm.
Why do you say that, Cisco?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to troubleshoot my Postman account.
Oh, all good.
Yeah.
Is it an account problem or is it a like Postman itself problem?
Yeah, it's an account. So I was basically trying to reset my password, and I'm sending the email to my account, my email account, but I'm not getting it. So, you
Also for
know,
Postman, you can sign up for Postman using a Gmail, if you want to have another way to do it,
right.
which is usually what I do. It's a little bit simpler
Yeah,
sometimes.
I got
But
you.
so the other thing to note for API requests is you don't always need to keep it in the same form in a required format, as long as it is a dictionary with the required fields. So in this case, you'll notice here I have title first, body second, user ID third. But in our GET request, when we got data from the API, it had user ID first, then it had an ID field and title and body. So the order is different, but the fields themselves are mostly the same. So let's try posting a post with this title and body and user to our API and see what we get back. Okay, so a couple of things to note. Previously, well, here, let's do that GET request one more time. So do the GET request just for comparison's sake. Again, here we got a 200 OK, saying that the request for getting information was successful. Now we get a 201 created. So a new resource was created successfully. What does that mean for us? Well, in this case, it means that the post request successfully posted or added data or sent data to this API. So in this case, we see that it added a post whose ID is 101. So hypothetically, if we were to run a GET request on the post with ID 101, no, okay, here we got a 404. But if this were to actually work, like for a real API where you're adding a post, then this 101st post would show up in the GET request. Yeah, Art, go ahead.
Can you give me a real life situation where an API would allow you, or the data source would allow you to alter their data? As it seems like if somebody of a, say, a third party that you're trying to access their information, like they're maintaining it. So if they have everybody that wants to just kind of alter that, it seems like it'd be kind of chaotic. So I'm assuming here you're altering somebody else's data source. So when's a real life situation that would actually happen?
Good question. So a lot of APIs are get or pull only, because they don't want you changing their data sources. But there are some cases, especially when you get to design your own APIs, where that is not the case. So for example, let's say that you're designing a social media site and you have an API that connects to your database of posts and users and things like that. This is an API that you've designed for your application. In that case, you would probably want to access that API via post requests so that you can, well, make new social media posts. And by adding to what's in the data, if that makes sense. Otherwise, for like publicly accessible APIs, there are not very many instances where you're going to be allowed to change their data.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? Great. So that was a pretty hopefully useful 101 for APIs. We're going to get more into this as we go forward because APIs and bringing in external data is one of the most important things in modern web programming, especially when it comes to making your websites non-static. So again, the whole reason that we use JavaScript with HTML is so that your websites are interactive. The whole reason we use APIs with JavaScript and Python and others is so that the data you get is not hard coded. So it all sort of comes together in a little bit of an ecosystem. So let's go ahead and think about a quote unquote real life use case for our APIs. So I've got a website here. Hopefully you guys are all seeing my VS Code now. So, and hopefully it's readable. So I've got a website here that looks relatively simple. It's basically just a bunch of nested divs and nested sections. Just div is nested. Or there's a def slash section there. Okay. So yeah, it's got a bunch of divs, a bunch of closing tag, a bunch of so divs, sections, and divs inside that. And we'll just put in like a fake temperature of like 65 Fahrenheit. So if we take a look at this website, I do have some CSS that we've cooked up as well, just to make sure that things look slightly nice. Um, and this is our website. Current temperature in Chicago is 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Is that accurate right now? Maybe. But does the temperature in Chicago change over time? Probably does. So how can we factor in the fact that the temperature changes into this website? Because, right, well, the easy option is whenever the temperature changes, you just go and tell your web developer, hey, the temperature in Chicago changed from 65 degrees to 80 degrees. Can you save that in the website? And they can go in and make the manual change and go back. That's a terrible way of going about it. The other thing that you can do is you can ask the user of your website, hey, what is the temperature in Chicago today? Can you type it and create like a text box and stuff? Your user can type in the temperature and then they'll show up. But that goes against the whole principle of the website. The whole principle of the website is to display the current temperature in Chicago, not the other way around. So let's take a look at how we can use an API in order to get us the temperature in Chicago. So there's an API by Meteo or Meteo.com. Let me see if I can find the documentation for this. Here we go. So can you guys all see the screen with the free weather API? Awesome.
Yeah.
So this is what we're going to be starting with. So again, so in general, if you're looking up APIs that you want to use, key things are going to be open source and non-commercial use. In general, those two things will mean that it's free for low data volumes, which is generally what you want to look at. So let's take a look at the API documentation. And oh boy, that is a lot of different things. So so it looks like it takes in some sort of a location. And it can give you a forecast. These are a bunch of different variables it takes into account. And so it can also, in addition to doing every 2 minutes hourly weather, it can also give you daily weather and current weather. So it looks like what we probably want is temperature. And this over here looks like it's how we use the API. So we're going to forget this latitude and longitude because that is not Chicago's lat long. But an important thing to keep in mind is when you are making a get request using this API, you do need to input or tell it these specific parameters. So again, documentation is somewhat unique in terms of the way that it's set up, where you have all these different options. Another one, which is a little bit easier to use, is here. Let me see if I can find it, just so I can show you guys what documentation can look like. Um, Here's another API, which is useful. So this is for something called the Pokemon API, which is basically just or Poke API, which is basically an API that provides data about all things related to the Pokemon universe. So this is a pretty well constructed API in terms of its documentation and its user friendliness. So first thing you'll notice is here it says you can only use the get method. So Art, this goes back to your question about, well, can you tell people not to use a pull or not to use a post request? And the answer is yes, you can restrict that. So we'll just keep scrolling here, past all the ads. Um, And you can take a look at examples here of some of the things that you can get from this API. So there's an endpoint here called Berry that you can get using this format of link. And then this is the type of data that you'll get back from it. Likewise, if we go to the Pokemon API, what's a simple one? Sure. Let's look at these Pokeathlon stats. So here again, this is another, it tells you the exact format of the GET request you're going to run. And then over here, this shows you the JSON that you're going to get out of it. It also is really nice in that it goes into more detail in terms of the data types of the things inside of the JSON dictionary that gets returned. So this is, again, if you want an API with really good documentation, like the Poke API is definitely up there in terms of how good their documentation is. All right, so let's go back to Postman. And let's go ahead and try pulling in that data of ours for Chicago for current weather. So we've got a link here. We're going to, again, make this a GET request. So you'll notice when I copy paste in this link, we now have something that didn't show up before called params. Now again, this is our old GET request for our JSON placeholder where there's nothing in params. But now we do get things in params. Can anyone tell me what these parameters are and what these query params might be? So when I pasted in this link, why did all of these things auto-populate? Where did they populate from?
They populated from the JSON data, and they're the key value pair or key value pairs within the JSON data.
Exactly. So now again, this is yet another GET request, but the only thing we're doing now is we are providing information to specify what specific thing we want to get back. For example, if we didn't specify a lat long, it wouldn't know what location we want to get this data for. So we can specify that again in our parameters. Or likewise here, we are specifying that we want the current weather. Now, hypothetically, what we could do is I can uncheck this box and it'll disappear from the full GET request. Likewise, I can change the longitude. So let's say we're going to change it to 97 out of 87, and it changes the request that we make. So let's go ahead and send this over. And whoa, okay. So when we send over our GET request, we get a ton of data back. So let's break this down and let's see what data we actually need or what's important. So what data are we looking for again for our website? Does anyone recall?
Yeah.
Current temperature. So what things are probably going to be important in this JSON for us to get that temperature back? So probably don't need most of this. Whether units temperature, well, that looks useful. So we now know that the current temperature is 7.1 degrees Celsius. So, for example, if you wanted to get this in Fahrenheit, we'd have to go through the documentation, but there's probably a way to specify the units of temperature. You probably specify that as Fahrenheit somewhere. But for right now, we're just going to do it in Kelvin. So what we'll probably have to do is get our JSON, save it as some variable name. Let's just pretend to call it like weather JSON, and then return like weather JSON, current weather temperature. And that gets us the information that we want. So again, this is a useful way to use Postman, sort of test out your API call. So now we know exactly what format is going to be returned to us, and we know how to pull the data that we're looking for. So now that we have that identified, let's go back to VS Code, and let's go ahead and try to figure out how we can make this happen uh, by using JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and make a script tag, and we're going to link it to this week's 7day3.javascript. And yeah, so we're going to do all of our editing now inside this blank JavaScript file. All right, so when we have an API, um, we want to be able to put this data into our website. There's probably, just thinking off the top of my head here, there's a couple of steps of things that we need to do. But the first thing we need to figure out is how do we get data from our API source in JSON. Once we get that data, then we need to extract the temperature from the JSON data. Then we need to change temperature or update temperature on website to match extracted data. So this is sort of going to be our three-step. Oh, and the other thing we should do is we should also mention that we want to do this on page load. Well, this is going to basically be our quote unquote three-step process for how do we go from a simple API to actually using the API data. So let's start off with the first one, getting data from our API source. So the way that we're going to do that in JavaScript is by using something called the fetch API. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a function. We'll call it like we'll write a function. Let's call it like weather API call, and it's not going to take in any inputs. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make this an asynchronous function. Does anyone know what an async function does? Okay, no, that's totally fine. And again, this is not something that you need to worry about too much right now, but we will need to worry about later on. So whenever we are going to access an API, using fetch in JavaScript. You always have to use an async because it returns something called a promise. So a promise is, in broad terms, kind of like a expectation of getting data back, even if that data doesn't actually come back. Because there's no guarantees that the API will return the data you want. If you say make a bad request. So it returns something called a promise. But again, more on that later. So the first thing, there's three different components that we're going to break down. The first one is we're going to define a API URL, this is basically going to be source of our data. And I'm going to again copy paste that from Postman. So we're going to go pop that to here. Once we have the URL, the next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to fetch the data from our URL. So we're going to say, we'll define this as const response. It's going to be await fetch. We're going to fetch from, as it says here, the URL. So we're going to fetch from API URL. And the reason we have an await is, again, because of a promise. But again, more on that later. But basically, you sort of think about this as the response means that everything that happens after can only happen once the data is received. So if it takes a really long time to pull the data, you have to wait or await pulling the data in. So wait to pull data from my URL. And then the last step is that we need to interpret our response and turn the response into JSON. We're going to call this const whether JSON is going to be await response.json. And we're going to say wait until data is pulled, then turn it into JSON. So these are sort of the three main steps for us at present. So does this make sense? Are there any questions about the steps needed to go from API URL to pulling the data down?
Omar, line 6, when you're doing that JSON, you're just telling it like we want this data to be in the JSON format, so we want it to be a dictionary. But isn't it coming as a dictionary already?
Yes and no. So in JavaScript specifically, when we use fetch API, it's going to, as it says here, return it as a promise, which is not JSON or HTML or anything like that. A promise is basically not to get into the details, but it's a JavaScript object that essentially expects to hold data from the API. Once that promise is fulfilled, you then need to turn that data into a format that you can use, which you could do response.json, you could do response.xml, I'm pretty sure. I think there's a couple of other types that you can use in order to interpret your data. But you have to turn it from a promise into JSON or another format first.
This might be a dumb question, but why are we doing this in JavaScript versus Python, or does it not have the same ability to pull this, or is there a specific reason?
So let me flip that back to you real quick. So the main purpose of this exercise today is to manipulate the website itself, which is the other half of the equation that we haven't gotten to yet. But we want to be able to change it so that 80 degrees Fahrenheit on this website is not hard-coded data, but is rather something that changes based on the API. Is it easier to manipulate an HTML website using JavaScript or using Python?
Yeah, good point. JavaScript for
Yeah.
sure.
I will say though, later on, as in pretty soon. We will talk about how to use APIs and integrate them into Python, which personally I like that way more. Uh, but it's really good to know to use it in JavaScript for right now, just because we are in the web dev unit. But we will learn about how to do this with Python soon. It's a pretty similar process.
Cool.
All right, so let's keep moving forward. Again, unless there's more questions. So our next step is going to be to extract the temperature from our JSON data. So let's go back to Postman and again examine what our JSON data looks like. So we have all of this information, but what we want to get to is this 27.1. So can someone tell me what the correct way to get this temperature from this random JSON thing is?
You can create a variable. You can create a variable and place JSON. Well, if you go back to your VS Code, yeah. So yeah, you can create a variable and then say weather JSON dot current weather dot temperature to pull that temperature.
Switch your weather temperature.
Yeah.
Oh, we don't use something cool. So okay, I'm going to break this down to here. So this is the current temperature in Chicago. All right, cool. So now we have extracted the temperature from our JSON data. Um, and now the last part that we need to do is actually update the temperature on the website to match extracted data. And we need to do that on page load. So I'm going to break this out into two separate things. We'll say uh, do this or get the weather, Chicago weather on page load. So how do we do the last part?
Do a window dot unload function.
Yes, window dot on load.
And then
And
yeah, and then place the weather API call inside of it.
yes, so I'm just going to do this using the arrow function, or okay, we'll just do it normally. And then we'll just say weather API call. Okay, we'll do it this way. So again, this way, as Cisco mentioned, the moment I load the page, it's going to immediately go and get the data that we want. Now, you could change this from an on load to being, let's say, like an on click, if you wanted this to happen when someone presses a button, or on mouse over, or some other thing. But in our case, for simplicity, we're going to do it the moment the individual opens up the web page. So the last thing we need to do now is the little part in the middle of how do we update the temperature on the website to match the extracted data. So this is going to get back to the DOM manipulation stuff that you guys learned about a couple of days ago. So what we could do is, so specifically what I want to do, I want to modify whatever is inside of these p tags. Anyone have any ideas for how we can do that? Besides Cisco, since you just went. Nicole, do you want to give it a shot?
I remember I did this, but really, I'm trying to remember how I did this.
This is fair.
I was like, hold on, let me pull it. Let me. So I used it, document get element by ID. So
Okay.
I would assign a variable, con, uh, temperature or something, and then equals document get element by ID, and then put the element ID in parentheses with post. So it was, what was it?
It's just, yeah, that should work. I'm also just going to define a function to do this real quick. So we'll say update temperature. And we'll just add here. Okay, so once we have the element on our web page, how can we update it?
Then you just can uh, message dot text content, or no, temp element dot text content, and then you can change the output.
So you could do that. You can also use inner text, which is just essentially whatever's between the tags. And now, well, we need to change this to this guy. So there's a couple ways we can do it. We're going to just go with the easy way, and we're just going to run update temperature, inputting whatever the temp is, and we're just going to add in current temp, which is going to go right in between our parentheses. So one important thing to note is we are never actually returning something in any of these functions. This is all just either this one is just getting stuff from an API, and this one is just manipulating the DOM. That's all we're doing. No returns, which is somewhat important to know. Now, actually, you know what? Here, let's just change this a little bit. We'll just make it current temp and then Celsius. I think that's how you spell it. No, let me put a $sign. There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what happens when we run our website now. So what happened there? It first showed us 80 Fahrenheit, which is exactly what we hard coded in. However, as the page loaded in, it then went and pulled our data from our API to say 26.6 degrees Celsius. I think that's pretty cool. So congratulations, you've now successfully been able to make a website that pulls in data from somewhere else on the web and displays it for you to use. That's it. That's pretty much today's lecture. Any questions about GET requests, POST requests, or using these to make a website that pulls from an API?
Omar, can we go back to the .js file?
Sure.
Let me see what line is it? I think that's line 18. Can you kind of break down the backtick $ stuff? Like,
So do you
what
remember
is that?
F strings in Python?
Yes.
That is equivalent to an F string in Python. So what the $, so the backticks will essentially tells JavaScript, hey, sorry, excuse me, 1 second. because my laptop is almost dying, so I have to provide a bit of a respite. Um, so the backticks are telling JavaScript, hey, this is a string that is not just a normal string, but expect it to have some variables inside it. The variables are then what go inside of the curly brackets. Lastly, the dollar sign is what tells JavaScript that that is a variable that it wants you to put in that string.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank
Any other questions? Okay, so let's go ahead and